it's my great pleasure to be here today with Oliver Robinow, who is the grandson of one of the first historical pianists who I came across when I was getting into historical recordings. And after I bought this remarkable record at a secondhand shop, and there is this phenomenal presence on the front cover, a figure largely overlooked, but today more and more appreciated, I believe, as some recordings have been coming to light. Ilona Eibenschu, who was born about 150 years ago, if we can figure out exactly what year she was born. But she was a remarkable musician who studied with Clara Schumann, who worked with Brahms and premiered some of his works and played with musicians who knew Brahms. And she lived until 1967, if I'm correct. Yet she retired around 1902-03, which is pretty incredible. But there are some private recordings from late in her life that show the incredible strength of character and uncompromising musical vision that I think make her one of the most fascinating figures in recorded history. And so I'm very happy to be here with her grandson, Oliver, to talk about the great Ilona Eibenschu. Oliver, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you for asking me.
We only met then in person through mutual friends briefly in Vancouver about a year and a half ago, and had plans to meet about a year ago. And that was around the time that COVID kicked in and all of our travel plans were scuttled. And so we haven't been able to get together in person, but I'm glad that we're able to connect online and actually share this conversation with the wider musical loving public. So again, thank you for being here.
Well, I met my grandmother when I was a child. She lived in London, England, and we lived in Southern Ontario. Okay. But my mother took me back when I was 9 to visit, and then again I went at 16, and then again at 20. So okay. I knew her in the days before she died, but I met her several times before she died. But she was already quite old. What was remarkable was that she, who was always a very small person, I think she was only 5'1" or so, okay. And had shrunk, of course, when she became an old lady, but she had tremendous presence when she played the piano. She would sit bolt upright. She had a large engagement ring from 1902, which she would ceremonially take off and put beside the keys on the piano so her hands were free, and then she would be right back into 100 years before.
Wow.
She had still a strength, a poetry in her playing, which you can hear on some of these private recordings. Her story is quite remarkable because she was a wunderkind. She came from a musical family. An aunt was an opera singer. Brother was quite a successful musician and a director. She was the 13th of 13 children born to a cantor in Budapest. The story is that when she was 3, she was playing with a doll under the piano while her brother was practicing. And she looked up and said, "Das ist falsch." It was a bad note. And he checked his music, and yes, it was. So he paid a little more attention to her. And then she began to take lessons at 3-4 years old. By the time she was 6, it was everybody was aware that she was an extraordinary talent. And being as they were in Hungary, they took her to elderly Liszt in his monastery, where she played for him and apparently with him. And he said, "She's really, yes, this is the real thing." Too young for his taste, perhaps, luckily. And he recommended that they put her in the Vienna Conservatoire. And so the family moved to Vienna. And she entered the conservatory at 10 years old, 9 years old. The only story I know from there is that along with her, there was a boy a year older with lovely curly golden locks, which she was very jealous of, having straight black hair. This was Fritz Kreisler, and the two children played lots of duets while they were both there.
Wow.
She played her first public big performance at age 9 with the Vienna Philharmonic, a Mozart concerto or so. She was so small she couldn't reach the pedals, but her reaction to it when she came off stage was, "That was so much fun. When can I do it again?" Another story from the time was that because she was a Wunderkind, Herr Bösendorfer, who made pianos, provided a piano to her, and she really liked his music, his voice. And there was a moment when she was, I presume, in Berlin on a tour, and she was taken to the Steinway factory, and they said, "Please try out. What do you think of these?" "I don't know." And she, 8 years old, 9 years old, said, "These are very nice, but don't you have any Bösendorfers?" So how that ended, we don't know. She had a sort of proto-career as a sort of wunderkind. It was like a little tiny Mozart. You know, she went everywhere. She played literally for crowned heads of Europe, for the Kaiser, for the Tsar. But by the time she was 11, 12 years old, she felt she didn't really know enough. I mean, talent, it's not, there's a story that somebody says, it's not sufficient to be Hungarian. You must also have talent. Well, she was both, but she didn't have the discipline. She didn't have the understanding.
Right.
And luckily, she was accepted by Clara Schumann at age 13 to be a student. And again, details I don't know, but apparently there was a wealthy musicophile family in Frankfurt who defrayed the cost of her 5 years in the house of Clara Schumann. And while she was there, she was at age 13 introduced to Brahms, who came to visit every now and then. And as she evolved, Clara Schumann recommended her to Brahms. So Clara Schumann sort of launched her on a career at 1889, so she was 17 or 18. Again, small things which will make her more human. When she was 17, she played in London, and she was reviewed by Bernard Shaw, and it's in his big volume, Shaw on Music. And he describes how this very pretty, startlingly dark, pretty, small lady hurtled across the stage, rushed and grabbed the piano stool, and then sat down and pulled herself together. My grandmother said this was because she was her first performance there, she was wearing her first really long dress, and she tripped over it as she was entering on stage. But Shaw goes on to say that as soon as she started playing, she had everybody wrapped around her hands.
Right.
Was a great success. Again, she had a career that took her all over. She had 2 tours to Italy in 1899, 1898. And on the second of those, she played in Milan, and Verdi asked her to come to his hotel to play to him. He was too old and frail to come out. And, she very tactfully played all kinds of excerpts from his operas, but he said he had never been so charmed and so delighted by a pianist, and actually got up and walked her down the corridor to the stairs and so on. Great honor, and I'm pleased to say we've got an autograph of his from that occasion. She was became a friend of Brahms, I think, because she was, first of all, she was a consummate pianist, but also she was very pretty and she was feisty. She didn't mince her words. She was quite straightforward with people. I think he liked that.
Mhm.
She tells the story, and this is, I think you can hear it on the YouTube copy of her little memoir, that just before she left Clara Schumann's house, she played in a house concert with Brahms there, and she played Beethoven Opus 111, which is fairly, requires a lot of fancy footwork, and it's quite a difficult piece.
Mhm.
And a few months later, she was in Vienna and at a musicians association of Vienna, and she was to play, and there was to be a cellist in the second half, and Brahms was there. And just before she started playing, they got word that the cellist had backed out. He couldn't come for one reason or another. So Brahms just looked at her and said, "Well, why don't you play the Opus 111?" And I like it. She says, "I did so." I mean, as if, look, oof, you can blow it off. And he appreciated, that she didn't say, "Oh my God," and have a lot of flutter. She said, "Okay, what you like, you get." And he enjoyed her company. Her family had a house at Bad Ischl, where he came often for summer holidays. That was the place where the emperor had a cute little 33,000 square foot hunting lodge. And she again talks of how she would play with Brahms, with quartets, playing his quintet, with him sitting and smoking and enjoying himself. Oh yes, the most important for her was in 1893, when he was visiting. He said, "Oh, I've got some new pieces. Want to play them?" And he took her to the music room in her parents' house and wouldn't let anybody else in. And he played for her the Opus 118, 119. And again, she, with her sharp comebacks, she said, "That's terrific. I've got to write to Clara Schumann about them." And he said, "But you didn't like them." "Why you say that?" "Well, you didn't ask da capo for any of them." "I want them all da capo, but not today." Bam, enough. I mean, she was not to be put down. She did write Clara Schumann, and this was at the time when Brahms and Schumann had a falling out of some months a year, that they were not in communication, rather unhappy with each other. But Ilona wrote to Clara about these pieces, and Clara took the opportunity to write to Brahms and said, "I've just heard from Ilona about your new pieces, and may they," her letter, and because she belongs to both of us, you know, maybe we can get together. And Brahms wrote back and said, "I just played these. Glad to hear from you, and I just saw Ilona, and because she is yours, and because I got your letter, I played all the pieces again." So, and she was then, he gave them to her to introduce in Vienna initially, and then she introduced them in England. And this was the Saturday popular concerts at St. James's Hall in February the 10th, 1894. Beethoven and Schumann and so. There is the third item is new pieces for pianoforte alone by Brahms, by Mademoiselle Ilona Eibenschu. These were so new that they had not yet, at least in England, been given an opus number. And they were the last solo piano pieces that he wrote.
Mhm.
So again, her cheekiness, at one point, 1900, late 90s, she was invited to a country house weekend, and in the first class carriage, there was a very elegant man in top hat and wing collar, who got out at the same station, and they were both met, and they were taken to the house, and she was introduced, and it was Asquith, who was at that point, I think, Chancellor of the Exchequer. He wasn't yet Prime Minister. And when she met him and was told this is Chancellor of the Exchequer, she just burst out laughing and said, "Oh, I thought you were a clergyman." And he loved that. And so they became good friends. And my mother told me that during the war, the First World War, when he was Prime Minister, she remembers being in the nursery at 10 Downing Street, playing with Asquith's and Margot Asquith's son, who was her age.
Wow.
So then this was the time. Oh, let's see. The other interesting thing about her adventures, she was very popular in England, and she eventually settled there in the early 90s. So she did tour about, but she stayed there most of the time. And she became well known in the group of musicians, authors, painters, and they sort of entertained each other, and there was a certain amount of I wouldn't call it cynical, but back scratching between them. That if you were a painter and you could have wonderful musicians come to your soirees or your Sunday afternoon gatherings, it gave you some status. And if you were a musician and you were invited to these things, then it gave you some status. So it went back and forth. And she obviously made quite the impression, because John Singer Sargent did a charcoal portrait of her and her daughters. Edward Burne-Jones did a pencil portrait of her with her name inscribed and wreathed in laurel. And Alma Tadema asked to paint her portrait and did so. And we have letters from him, and we have also the painting itself. So again, she was well known and well liked and admired among these people. 1902, 1901, she met my grandfather, Karl Derenberg. He was 49 and she was 30 at the time that they married in 1902. He was a merchant banker, actually not a stockbroker, and he was a very fine amateur violinist, good enough that he had a Stradivarius, but not good enough that he could make a professional career. So he played for fun with friends. The violin was sold because his merchant banking efforts were involved Hamburg and London. And in the summer of 1914, a wall came down and his company went bankrupt because they had nowhere to go. And so he had to sell his violin. And just as a curious roundabout thing, we met the lady who at one point was playing on it in America, Eudice Shapiro, who was professor at UCLA and also was concertmaster of the Paramount Studio Orchestra for many years. So if you listen to the violin in the background when Gary Cooper is dying for whom the bell tolls, that was my grandfather's violin. The remarkable thing was that it went from being Stradivarius number such and such to being the Derenberg Stradivarius. It took his name because he was such a good person. He died in 1927, long before I came on the scene, of old age. He was 20 years older than she was. But he must have been a remarkably nice man. So they did marry 1902, and to our sorrow, and I don't really know why again, she stopped playing in public. It was the proper thing to do. I mean, married women didn't have careers, except Clara Schumann, who was rather special. And she really had a career only after her husband died, after all. She had to do something with 6 children. But Ilona played privately and played duets for 20 years with her husband. I remember again as a child, a whole wall, 2 big glass-fronted cabinets that were made for them, full of beautifully bound in green and red Morocco, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of duets, trios, piano trios, and so on, for the family, that they bought them and had them done up properly. The very sad thing is that though I married a first-rate violinist, I did it too late in 1975. My grandmother had died in 1967, and my aunt, who had been looking after her, gave all of this stuff to people she thought would enjoy it. And the music teacher, music master at Eton, got all of this beautifully bound music. And I'm sorry, but at least we know it went to a good home. So what's remarkable in the end about her is that if you listen to her music, she was it, I can't remember if it was Rubinstein or who said, it's not important if you make a mistake or not, as long as you get the music right. And so you hear her at 80 playing, and she had a wonderful singing tone. She used rubato in a rather extravagant way, but it was the fashion then. And if your listeners will go to YouTube and Google her there, look for her there, you can hear her playing, and you can hear this is somebody who heard Brahms play it. This is somebody who heard Clara Schumann play it. Her husband's music, her own music. And it's a straight pipeline done.
And this is one of the things that struck me so much is, the first time, I was barely a year into listening to historical recordings when I heard these, those very few official recordings she made around 1902. The only studio recordings she made before retiring.
Interesting.
And yet you can still hear, like, there's the backbone that's so clear. Like there's an uncompromising, unwavering sense of authority. And what amazes me is that you hear recordings of her when, these private recordings you're speaking of, where she's, 80 or so. And you hear this, it's completely undiminished. I mean, the force and the strength is so there that it just transcends. It's as if those 50 years hadn't passed.
Now I will play the beginning of the ballad.
you have absolutely no sense that you're listening to a woman in her 80s. But what you do hear is, like you're saying, stylistically, you hear something that's so different, but she's coming from this age where the music was new, as we were saying, that it was new music. And so as much as, you know, our tastes might have changed, you know, her playing that in 1952, it's so not the style of 1952. And yet there's an appreciation of this music. There's a reason why this music has persevered and why people are still wanting to hear it. So hearing that direct line. And that said, she strikes me as somebody who didn't have, you know, I sense a difference between Clara Schumann's approach and Brahms, whereas I think Clara Schumann had a very strict kind of, this is the right way, a bit of a, you know, her perception and this is how it should be. Whereas Ilona also had her sense of how things should be. And I said, looking at some of the letters where Clara's writing in capital letters, you know, admonishing her.
Underlining.
Yeah, underlining and saying, you know, this is how you should be playing. And yet I'm not so sure. I suspect Ilona might have said, okay, you know, well, she's saying that and this is how I think it should be done.
Well, on that note, let me read you. This is a translation of a letter from Clara Schumann to my grandmother, September the 6th, 1890. So this is just within a year after she was set free.
Right.
Dearest Ilona, I was really rather disappointed yesterday to note that none of the pieces you played were perfect, and I think you should therefore have a fortnight's quiet study here in Frankfurt to prepare you for Cologne and Berlin. I have told you so often of my fear that because of the ease with which you learn, you are tempted not to practice conscientiously enough, underlined. I could prove this to you in every piece which you played yesterday, underlined, and would like to go through them all with you once more. I wish I could spare you the experiences which are inescapable if you do not learn to be stricter with yourself. You will see in my candor surely only the motherly concern and forethought of yours sincerely, Clara Schumann. Any teacher could have written that in the last 150 years. That's modern.
And yet, and you know, we can get the sense, of course, there's the caring and so on and so forth. But you know, listening to, imagining Clara Schumann and imagining Brahms, I suspect that again, part of that affinity that Brahms had for her was that unwavering, uncompromising, like you were saying, just, you know, she wants to do something, she does it. And so I wonder if your grandmother shared with you any actual perceptions, anything to do with Clara Schumann about what she herself felt, you know, receiving these letters, and whether she felt that Clara was perhaps too restrictive or strict, or.
I think, well, you can read into it what you want. I'm afraid she didn't, and there are two reasons, I think. One is that I, as a child and adolescent, brought up far distant by my mother, who didn't always appreciate the way Ilona behaved, because Ilona was pretty headstrong. And that is the second thing, that Ilona liked to talk about herself. And she did talk a bit about Brahms, but she sort of felt that she was the center of the universe. And if you bring Clara Schumann into it, it begins to confuse things. So I'm afraid I don't have anything to say, except first she told my mother, when she was teaching my mother to play piano, that Clara Schumann had always said, you have to make the piano sing. That we do know. I think they must have got along quite well, and Ilona perhaps schooled herself to accept what came from this agreeable, I agree, highly dogmatic lady, because Ilona did stay there for 5 years. And we have from other people who were taught by students who were of Clara Schumann at the same time, that Ilona was the best, the brightest, the hottest of the latter pupils. And clearly Clara Schumann thought this too, and really launched her.
Hmm.
Yeah, no, her independence, again, just anecdotes that come. She was invited, as I said, to crowned heads. She was invited to Windsor Castle on several occasions. We have an extremely ugly amethyst brooch labeled Victoria R. Ainley. But the third time she was invited, she said no, because she said, they don't pay you. And I would have to buy a new dress, and I would have to, voyage across the channel and trains. And so, no. So she didn't bother. Though the first time she played, she was nervous. And that she did tell me. She said she was quite nervous, but when she walked into the room, she saw that Victoria was even shorter than she was. So that made it all right.
Like seeing her standing with that presence in that photograph, and then you have some other amazing photographs that even, at a young age, she had this sense of presence and this commanding presence. I never realized she was as short as you've just described until you mentioned that. I imagined that she would have been, at least 5.5, 5'10". I never would have imagined she was as
It was very small. And how she made her tiny hands stretch to the Brahmsian chords, I don't know.
Huh.
But she did.
She sure did.
Yeah.
And she certainly produced a volume of sound that, it really shows the technique, I think, that was there. There's an inner force, and there's a use of, gravity and so on and so forth, where it's not the striking of the keys in the same way. She really, but this is what we hear. And I think where one of the things that characterizes so much of the playing from, if we want to say, the golden age, that from a lot of those early pianists, is where the character is so clear through the playing, that the quality of the individual really comes through.
I think if people want to listen to the music, two pieces which I think really show what we're talking about of her character. One is the Schumann arabesque, and the other, the prophetic bird, oiseau prophète, because it doesn't sound like the way people play it now.
Not at all.
It sounds almost like a different piece, but on the other hand, apparently that's what they intended.
This is what's so amazing to me, is that, it's almost like this game of broken telephone, to think that within 25 or 50 years, things should be so different. We can barely imagine, 100 years later, 200 years later, how far off the mark we can be. So her playing is really, it's almost like this time capsule.
It is.
When you met her, was she still, was that kind of Victorian style still part of
yes
presence?
Yeah, she had a large hat. I remember going out with her when I was 9 or so, and an elegant silver-topped cane that she used, and she was quite commanding with taxi drivers or in restaurants and so on. Again, there was no question in her mind who was the center of the universe, and she could prove it too. Occasionally you meet people, lots of people feel that way, and they're quite annoying, but every now and then you meet somebody and it's true. They really are. And she was. It is a pity that she didn't play any, or she played, but not so much publicly, and certainly didn't teach. I think her personality, again, because of this, what were you talking about, this kind of rigidity, she wouldn't have been a good teacher. She would have been like Clara Schumann, but bossier, I think, not as kind to the people, I suspect.
Did she teach at all?
I don't think she did. I don't think she did. As I
And
say,
she played privately though.
she played privately, and again from my mother, I understand they had a house in Hyde Park Square, just north of Lancaster Gate, unfortunately bombed in the war.
Mm.
And in the music room, there were two pianos,
Hmm.
one for Mama and one for everybody else. But everybody else included people like Arthur Rubinstein, who came through there in 1920 or 21 and played duets with her. My mother says she can remember. She turned over for Rubinstein. She was 16,
Hmm.
and Anthony Asquith, the kid she played with in 10 Downing Street, he turned over for my grandmother. But must have been a nice afternoon.
Wow. One of the encounters that surprised me the most for this incredible like meeting of the minds that I really wish I was a fly on the wall for was when she met Dinu Lipati. And I mean, I remember reading in the biography soon after I got it around 1989 or so, that he was talking about meeting this old lady who had studied with Clara Schumann, and in the war, you know, she was clutching the letters under the staircase while the place was being bombed. I was like, well, it sounds like Ilona Eibenschu, but there's this other name here, you know, Ilona Derenberg. And with no internet at the time, I had no idea that that was her married name. And what Lipati said that was so fascinating is it seems that Ilona wanted to meet him, and somehow she had arranged it. So I don't know if she'd heard one of his records or somehow. But it was in April 1948 when he was in London to ironically record and perform the Schumann Piano Concerto, which has become the sort of the gold standard of the concerto. And he said in his letter, which I believe he wrote to his teacher, that he said he was initially apprehensive because he thought she might be you know, one of these people who clings to tradition and is kind of in that dead way, in a sense that I was almost suggesting with Clara Schumann, where things kind of become very rigid and boxed in. And he said instead he found completely the opposite. He said she was so alive and engaged and engaging, and they played for each other for hours.
Oh, nice.
And Lipati had actually played the Etude Symphonique, which was in his repertoire. And in fact, he had asked EMI to record, and then unfortunately it didn't happen before he got too ill. But she was pointing out things to him, and he was so fascinated. And he was somebody who said that, you know, when it comes to traditions, he says, you know, it can be a little bit like dressing up an adult in adolescent clothing if you try to preserve things too much.
Mm-hmm.
So it's fascinating that while she still had that Victorian presence, there's still a quality where her playing, there is this vivaciousness and aliveness that breaks through, in a sense, the oldness in a certain way. Like it seems like she keeps the very best qualities while still keeping the freshness and aliveness. And that's something that he seems to be speaking to in that encounter.
An episode that I didn't know about. I love it. I think
it's
quite moved to hear.
Yeah, I mean, and it's such a shame that there isn't a photograph of the two of them, because it boggles the mind almost, because they're such, on the one hand, different musical personalities, and yet there is that common thread of going straight to the heart of the music, and in a sense, not caring what others think.
Well, we did to balance that for closer to the present. We talked to Malcolm Frager. He did the Schumann concerto here before, well, must have been the early maybe
late 80s.
Late 80s.
He died around 91 or so.
Yeah, well, late 80s, relatively soon before he died, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And we went backstage after listening to him at the Vancouver Symphony and invited him over and he said, oh my goodness, my teacher, he's the one my teacher told me about her and said that she was way the best of the students.
Mm-hmm.
And he listened to her playing, and we met him again before he left town. And he said, you know, the next night I had to play the Schumann again, and I changed it because of what I heard.
Wow.
She made an impression. She had an effect.
Really did. And that's what strikes me when you hear these recordings, and I'll be putting a few recordings into this conversation so that people can, you know, hear them in context, that there's that projection. like that forward momentum, but it doesn't sound, and even though there's a speed that's surprising now, because I think people seem to think that, you know, with romantic or, you know, with emotion, it needs to be sentimental and it needs to be slow and it somehow imbues it with more meaning. And in fact, it's just the shaping and the projection of the line that she's able, and she takes things, sometimes it seems like double the speed.
That's being 80 or 82. I mean, things just do speed up. You do.
But again, we have to consider that there's a level of authoritativeness, and we hear the same thing in Frager's teacher, Carl Friedberg, who's another, you know, phenomenal. It's the same kind of thing that you hear in aliveness. You hear a stretching of the line in lyrical sections that's so different from what it is that we expect, where we almost think that the black and white notation should be setting the framework, as opposed to it's, you know, these lines are actually soft lines because they're simply giving us some relative note value as opposed to absolute value of the line or the phrase.
I would say, as a sort of a wind up toward the end, a nice story. Ilona kept a lot of her interesting things from her past. We have these programs, and I will send you a photograph. But she also kept all the letters and notes that Clara Schumann wrote to her. And in 2015, we were in Bonn visiting and went to the Schumann House, which is the private hospital where Schumann was sequestered for the last 2 years of his life before he killed himself. And they had a small museum there with some memorabilia and autographs and occasional photographs. And I had been wondering what to do with these letters from Clara Schumann, because we had this wad of 50-something notes and letters. But we didn't want to give them to a university library because they would go into the archive. And somebody like yourself who was interested in researching could go down there and dust them off and then read. But we wanted them to have a life. And so I talked with the Ingrid Bosch, Dr. Bosch, the director of the State Museums in Bonn. And she made a real kind of like somebody's master's degree thesis. Every letter looked at, every detail, everything that was mentioned was researched. For instance, where Clara, when she wrote in that letter that I read out, said, "You must prepare for Cologne and Berlin." In the book, they found this was the concert she played, this was the concert she played in Berlin. So all take care of. It's in German, but there are beautiful reproductions, lavishly done, I must say, of all the letters and photographs and connections with other people. So it's in 3 dimensions, that whole chunk of her life.
That's fabulous.
Wonderful thing. And I'm very pleased now that she has a new life because of this. And things are taken out of drawers and in the light of day now.
Yeah, I mean, we're so lucky that we have YouTube now, whereas previously, you know, it was just so, you know, it was impossible to get these, you know, find the original records.
Yeah,
you had to
find this anymore,
and you had to find this record, and, you know, now that, I mean, they are on CD, but, you know, a click of a button, you know, you Google somebody's name, and one of the first things that shows up is actually on Google now is the page that I made of her on my website. You know, and so it's just amazing that we can just click out a few buttons and we can hear, you know, the voice of somebody, and you think that I'm listening to the voice of, and that person spoke to Brahms and listened to Brahms and heard Brahms, and you're hearing directly from the you know, from the horse's mouth these incredible tales of stories that we just otherwise wouldn't know.
One day after dinner, Brahms said, "Oh, I want to play you, well, a few exercises which I have just composed." Only Professor Wendt and my family were present, but he would not allow them to enter the music room, and they had to listen outside on the stairs. He just tried the piano and then began to play the G minor ballade, intermezzi, the Rhapsodie in E flat. In fact, all the Klavierstücke opus 118 and 119. He played as if he were just improvising, with heart and soul, sometimes humming to himself, forgetting everything around him. His playing was altogether grand and noble, like his compositions. It was, of course, the most wonderful thing for me to hear these pieces, as nobody yet knew anything about them. I was the first to whom he played them.
There she was in England, playing trios with Joachim in his 70s and Piatti. She must have been quite the number to keep up with them. You think of Joachim, age 13, playing Beethoven concerto conducted by Mendelssohn. And here he is 50 years later, playing again and again. As I say, for years they played the trios together, quartets and so.
And yet, do you not think, I mean, I'm interested in the fact that she was so strong. And even, you know, you're saying when you knew her as well, there was that commanding presence, that it almost, to me, on some level, it seems inconsistent that somebody with that strength would give up the career where music was so focused. I'm interested in that.
Well, that I don't have a useful answer to give. I think I sound like I'm being cynical about it. I think she had a taste for the finer things in life. Her husband, at least until 1914, they were pretty wealthy.
Yeah.
She enjoyed society. They became best friends with the Asquiths. I mean, so that sort of took up her time. And I think she felt she was I suspect she felt she was kind of owed that. But I think it is a pity. It is a pity. She certainly didn't give up being musical. I mean, she did play a lot privately, but it was not for work. It was for her pleasure. And she had 25 years of very happy music making with her husband. But no,
so no sense.
She didn't mention it, and I think it was. I think it reflects rather badly on her that she didn't make an effort to teach. Because you know, Carl Friedberg did, Adelina de Lara did. You know, not that my grandmother had anything nice to say about Adelina de Lara. She was an also-ran as far as I don't know what's good.
Well, I mean, you know, and it's true. Ilona really was to me in a class of her own. I mean, when I think of the Brahms connection more than the Clara Schumann connection, although, you know, Friedberg studied with Clara Schumann as well. Friedberg and Eibenschu are, for me, the top.
But apparently Friedberg thought she was the top.
Yeah.
And again, you go back and think that Brahms, to kind of pick her out and say, this girl plays my music the way I think it should sound. I will give you another, I'll send a picture also of that double autograph we have, our autograph book, in which on one page, Clara Schumann has written complicated arpeggios. It said, zur Erinnerung an den Lebensjahr Ilona Eibenschu, zur Erinnerung an Clara Schumann, to dear Ilona Eibenschu, in remembrance from Clara Schumann. And my grandmother was on such terms with Brahms that she sort of, next week they were having dinner together, and she nudged him and said, see what Frau Schumann wrote in my book. And he said, oh, just give me a pen. And on the next page, he wrote arpeggios going the opposite direction. And he says, zur Erinnerung an den Leben Johannes Brahms, in remembrance of dear Brahms. So it's a little family in-joke, his sense of humor and her rigidity and
Yeah.
solidity,
Yeah.
very nicely balanced off.
Wow.
But
Amazing.
it shows what he thought of her, that he could do it and make a joke.
I'm just curious about those late recordings. So we know the BBC, the talk of her speaking about Brahms comes from something she'd published in a magazine, I believe, a couple of decades earlier, and then she read that over the radio in 1952.
Right.
How did those recordings at home get made? So they had a record player? Or?
She wanted a professional recording. People brought their vacuum tubes and so on up to her apartment. She lived on the top floor of a big house in Holland Park, one of these great big white boxes. Okay. And they were done, she did them partly as Christmas presents for family, but I think she commissioned them. I don't think anybody else paid for them. Speaking of such things, when her piano did wear out, Steinway just gave her a new one. So the one she had when she died was the second generation, so to speak, but it was a treat.
So, and that would have been in the 40s or 50s, as late as
that would have been in the 40s.
So then she was still known in that circle.
Oh yes, 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 she must have been
pretty remarkable.
So yeah, they were done as very private, and I think they were commissioned by her. And alas, they're 78s, and really such a lot is lost, but you can hear the style. I mean, the actual sound of the piano doesn't matter quite so much.
Totally.
We can do good pianos now.
But it's the playing. It is the style, and it is, as we were saying, I mean, it's this window into such a completely different world. I mean, you're describing her, her presence in London, with the wide brimmed hat and the walking stick and so on. And this is around the time where it was, the mini skirts in Carnaby Street.
Absolutely.
So it's this completely different age, but that, again, that uncompromising vision where, she was who she was, and that's what it is that we hear in these recordings.
It was a pleasure knowing her too. She was an exciting person. She really was, and her reminiscences were. I can hear in my way that I make her sound as though she was kind of a bit on the tough side, so to speak. And that's not really true. It's more what you were saying, that she was very sure of her position and sure of her musicality, and had no doubts about how to provide it to the world.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that even though, her career, for whatever reason, didn't go in the direction that some of us might have hoped, and same with recordings, that at least we still have some.
She could have done another 30 years or so, but we have got something.
Yeah, but at least
anyway.
we have. Thank you so much for sharing these amazing memories, and I'll close out here with a recording of her as well, to just leave a little bit of a lingering, that atmosphere that she created so beautifully. Thank you so much for sharing.
It's a pleasure to talk to her, of her, and talk with you, Mark.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye.